What's up, castaways? This is Miles Away. So, the exciting news is out. The Oberheim OB-X8 is coming. I know I'm excited. I've already pre-ordered one. I've got to admit, I'm going to be selling a whole bunch of gear to afford it, but it's probably the synthesizer I'm the most excited about in years. So I thought this would be a great time, as everyone's talking about the return of Tom Oberheim, to reflect back on what is still to this day currently my all-time favorite synth, the Sequential OB6. Now, I already did a almost 1 hour long video on the OB6 that is still getting great feedback to this day, so I'm going to link that below, as well as my entire custom patch bank demonstration. So if you just want to hear me play sounds and make sounds from scratch, check out those two videos. In this video today, I want to give you kind of my stream of consciousness of what my thoughts are on the OB6, how it's going to compare to the upcoming OB-X8, and just overall why I still think it's probably a very safe bet to pick up one of these, even with the announcement of the OB-X8. As always, if you like this kind of content, please remember to like and subscribe. I'm actually going to be doing a full-on comparison between the OB6 and my OB-X8 when it arrives in July or August. So stick around, stay tuned to the channel if you want to see that. I'm going to be going through everything in extensive detail and really trying to see which one, excels at what kind of sounds. All right, let's get started. Now, that demo track you just heard, some of you guys might have recognized it already. It's my song Neon Rapture that I released last year. Now, almost every synth on that track, with a few exceptions, is the OB6. And I really think that sound sums up what I love about the OB6 and the kind of flavor it brings to the table. It's like retro futuristic, where it's kind of nostalgic and warm and fuzzy, but at the same time, it has this kind of bite that you don't always get, at least from my, humble opinion, from vintage Oberheims. There's many different things that are going to contribute to that. So let's jump into the list of features and kind of, what I particularly love about this synth. So to start out, probably one of the most striking things about the OB6 in comparison to the new OB-X8 or any other Oberheim that's ever been released is it's really a hybrid between the Prophet series of synths from Sequential and the Oberheim series of synths from Tom Oberheim, of course. Now, the oscillator heritage, it is a little bit different than the Prophets, but it's much more close to something like a Prophet 6 than it is to any of the previous Oberheims. The continually variable wave shape between the oscillators and the addition of a sub-oscillator, that to my knowledge is something that is, taken directly from the Prophet 6 and has never really appeared on an Oberheim before. The other thing that I think is really cool about the OB6 and basically adds a ton of versatility to an Oberheim synth that probably wasn't there traditionally in the past is the addition of the Prophet series cross modulation. Now, previous Oberheims, they were always traditionally a little bit limited in their modulation capabilities, whereas with the OB6, even though I tend to use the polymod more sparingly, you can have a whole bunch of different textures through extremely high audio rate cross modulation that you're not really going to be able to get on a traditional Oberheim synth. I'm super curious to see if the OB-X8 will have anything similar to this. Let me know in the comments below if you know anything like that that's coming up on the OB-X8. But yeah, as for the OB6, that's absolutely one of my favorite things. Of course, the number one thing about this synth that everybody who preaches on them loves and always talks about is the filter. Now, there's no getting around it. The filter and the specific features of the filter, which I'll get to in a second, are one of the most unique and special things about this synth, period. So the OB6 has a 2-pole, 12 dB per octave SEM filter. Now, what's really cool about this filter is it's continuously variable between low pass, notch, and high pass, and it has a bandpass mode. And, I've heard that the OB-X8 is going to have all of those different filter types, but to my knowledge, the number one trick with the OB6 is not going to be present on the OB-X8, and that is, of course, being able to smoothly modulate between all those different filter shapes. Another thing to bring up here is just the overall workflow of the synth. I really appreciate that there's not a single screen to be found, and pretty much everything is fine-tuned the way that as a musician I would want it to be. I really find that this synth just allows me to create songs faster than any other synth. What I mean by that, let's take an example of another synth that I use quite often, my Novation Summit. The Novation Summit, I think, is just incredibly deep and rich sounding for sound design, but I find a lot of my time when I'm working with it is kind of figuring out and tweaking and going into the specific mod matrix, modulating the effects little by little, and really kind of chipping away like a sculptor with a piece of, with a piece of marble to try to get this masterpiece sound. Whereas the OB6, what I find, it's much quicker. What I'll do is I'll fire up an initialized preset while my track's playing, while I'm improvising over it, or I have a MIDI clip playing, and I'll just start organically turning knobs and, bringing in things in kind of broader strokes, because the sweet spot is so big, there's no screen to get distracted, and there aren't that many modulation options. So I find, bang, within 30 seconds, I've got a really usable track that just sounds really good, and the synth part really fits with the song and doesn't really need that much. A pretty clear example of this is there's only one velocity setting. You either choose to have velocity affect the filter or not affect the filter. You choose to have velocity affect the amplitude or not affect the amplitude. Now, you would think that's a pretty big limitation, but the way they've fine-tuned the velocity response for the filter especially is just so perfect that it saves me a ton of time of looking at numbers and screens by just saying, yep, I want velocity to affect my playing, and presto, now my playing is much more emotional and responsive. All right, limitations and cons. Now, as you know, with anything, the more time you spend with something, with an instrument, the more you start to find little quirks and idiosyncrasies that maybe, aren't exactly the absolute best design choices. Now, thankfully, the OB6 doesn't have too many of these, but there are a couple. One, I really think the implementation of the mod wheel is kind of frustrating on this synth. Let me know in the comments if there's a different way to do this, but a very common thing with synths is to make the mod wheel open up the filter cutoff. Now with the OB6, the only way to do this is by setting your LFO to a square wave at the absolute slowest rate and then opening the filter with the mod wheel like that. But you give up your LFO, and if you hold it up for long enough, the filter is going to close anyway because it's an active live LFO. So that's really annoying there too. Secondly, another really common thing with the mod wheel is to, have it add in subtle vibrato. Now with the mod wheel, it's so sensitive. So anytime I want to add in subtle vibrato, whoops, I push the mod wheel up, 1 centimeter too far. And now the entire synth is doing this crazy detuned sine wave modulation. I really would have wished that there was, even if, without a screen, a sub menu where it was going to allow me to, have just filter to mod wheel, or, just a secondary digital LFO that just does your traditional vibrato to mod wheel, much like the new Oberheim has with the, vibrato secondary LFO. The only other con for me, which I think is something that I've made my peace with, is the effects section. I really just dislike the effects on this synth. I've really tried to use them in songs and they just never quite have the sound I'm looking for. The reverbs all sound really dated. The delay, for some reason, cuts the overall power of the synth, even at a very low mix level. And the phasers in the choruses are all right, but they're not something compared to, what a top tier plugin would be able to handle. Just the fact alone that the synth sounds so good by itself makes me a little bit sad that they've included this effects section, because I feel like it would have almost been better to not have any effects and then just reduce the price. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is the overall quality of the build and, of course, the elephant in the room, the price of the OB6. Now, obviously, this is a very expensive synth in where I live, Great White North of Canada. This synth costs almost 4,500 Canadian dollars new. Now, that's an extremely high price to pay for a synth. But in my opinion, I do firmly believe that as a professional musician, this has been one of the best investments I've ever made. It's just inspired me to make so much more music. It's really become a core part of my sound, and I'm totally aware that that's a lot of money and it's definitely not worth it for everyone. I think if you're, not absolutely in love with the raw tone of this synth, it's definitely not worth it to grab. But as far as the build quality, this thing is built to last. It's gonna be something I'm gonna hold on to for years and years. And that kind of brings me back to what I said at the outset of this video. I really don't think that when I get my OB-X8 that I am going to sell the OB6. Obviously, I'm excited to do this full comparison and let you guys know, which one I'm using more in my music. But at the end of the day, from what I've heard and looking briefly at the feature specs, they really do feel like they handle different sonic territory, and they really come from a different heritage. This synth is really not a traditional Oberheim, but it's also really not a Prophet either. And for that reason, I think it's destined to become a classic, and I really don't see the OB-X8, replacing it anytime soon. So if you're on the fence about one of these things and, you're looking for somebody to talk you off the edge, well, you know what, that's probably not going to be me, because I still feel like to this day in 2022, the OB6 is one of the absolute best synths on the market, and that's not going to change anytime soon. As always, guys, thanks so much for watching. I've been Miles Away. Stay tuned. Remember to subscribe. If you are curious in hearing me cover the OB-X8 and a comparison with the OB6, remember, I'm going to be doing that live here on this channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.